Welcome back to season 4 of the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danylchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in trauma treatment. I created this podcast because I'm surrounded by people who have dedicated their lives to navigating healing. There is so much wisdom in each guest this season, and my hope is that this show makes their important ideas and experiences available to you in a way that uplifts and inspires you. These guests and I have committed our lives to fostering health and joy in the world, even as we work through the impacts of trauma and face deep challenges. Let's dive into season 4 and let's keep talking about how we can heal. I want to give a big shout out and extend a huge thank you to the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, the ISSTD, for sponsoring this episode. If you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about the ISSTD and the incredible researchers, clinicians, and advocates I've met during my time as a member and a volunteer there. This group is made up of some of the kindest, most inspiring, intelligent people, and I'm happy to be able to share just a few of them here on the show. This organization has been delving into the science and best practice of treating trauma and dissociation for over 40 years now, and they have a rich catalog of educational offerings for both professionals and non-professionals on their website. That's cfas.isst-d.org. If you're a mental health professional, I highly recommend you consider becoming a member of ISSTD. I'd love to see you during their live educational offerings and at the annual conference in Boston in March of 2025. Go to isst-d.org to learn more. Welcome back to the How We Can Heal podcast. Today, our guest is Joanne Twombly. Joanne Twombly is a psychotherapist in private practice in Arlington, Massachusetts, with over 30 years of experience working with complex PTSD and dissociative disorders. She's an EMDR consultant, an ASH or American Society for Clinical Hypnosis consultant, and is certified in internal family systems. She's also a past president of the New England Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Joanne and I connected through the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, where she has been honored as a fellow and received a Distinguished Achievement Award. Joanne has recently written a book on dissociation and internal family systems, which we'll dive into today. Let's get started. All right, Joanne Twombly, welcome to the How We Can Heal podcast. I'm so happy to have you here today. I've followed your work, known about your work through ISSTD for many, many years, highly respect it, and I'm really interested selfishly about what you have to say about dissociation and IFS, because I've had some conversations along these lines, and sometimes consultees come to me and ask questions, and I always send them in your direction. So I think this will be a great opportunity for people to get an intro to your work, to learn a little bit more about what are the big ticket things to think about when we're combining this type of treatment with this type of experience or condition. So welcome.
Thank you.
I would love to know how you came to learn about dissociation.
Okay.
And then how you came to learn about IFS. And if there's any like dance in between there.
There's a dance. There's a bit of a dance.
Yeah.
I mean, I was working in an agency when I was a fairly young therapist, and I had worked for the state doing, social service, child abuse and neglect stuff for a while. So they tended to give me all of the more complex trauma cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a woman, a therapist, who had the old name MPD client, and she was going out on maternity leave. And I thought, well, that would be kind of interesting. I'd read Sybil. I was like, but I didn't get around to asking for it, but they gave her to me anyway.
Mm.
And then I took the apparently unusual step of actually learning how to treat her.
Yeah.
The psychiatrist said, well, I think it's a bad idea if you talk to parts. My supervisor, the director, knew nothing outside of a very narrow band of mostly, healthy, slightly neurotic people.
Yeah.
And so I started learning how to work with dissociative disorders and joined the Massachusetts component society of ISSTD
Nice.
and started getting training
Yeah.
and started getting more clients. So in any case, in that process, I learned hypnosis, which I think is the basis for good therapy, period.
Yeah.
Because you learn how to use language. And then eventually I did some energy thought field therapy training. Then I got EMDR training. And, my clients were doing well. And I became the president of the local trauma society, which is folded a couple of years ago. While I was the president, somebody came and talked about internal family systems. And I was like, yeah, the last thing I need is another ego state model. I'm
Right.
fine. I know all this stuff.
Yeah.
And we also have a lot of, I call it IFS speak.
Yeah.
Like they call parts managers, firefighters, and exiles. Exiles tend to be the kid parts who are holding all the burdens of traumatic material. Managers are like, managing life, and the firefighters are the ones who come out and binge drink when the exiles come out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was chatting with someone. I didn't bother to listen, but I went back to my day job, and in consultation groups, I had talked a lot of people into going to these meetings. And so they were all asking questions about IFS. So it's like, dang, I have to learn it.
Yeah.
So then I started getting training, and I was really impressed. I think the language is fairly elegant. I don't like when people suddenly start putting different labels on things that, are known by various names, like managers, exiles. I'm like, why?
Mm-hmm.
But, okay. And there's other stuff about it I find really helpful, and I use it with all my clients.
Nice.
However, there's some, and the reason, here, I'll show you. Show and tell, this is my book. But anyway.
Wait, hold it up one more second. I want to see. We've got Trauma and Dissociation Informed Internal Family Systems. Love it.
The reason why I pushed myself to write this book was that IFS has some really peculiar beliefs.
Mm.
I mean, so one belief is that all you need is IFS. You get IFS training, you need nothing else.
That's probably problematic for any training, right? I can't think of a single training I can say that about.
It will heal the world. That's
well, that's the enthusiasm that comes when we find something that works. We go, this is the thing, and I think I've felt that way about yoga, but I've always known, I really believe there's something about yoga that can help anyone, but that might be the principle of nonviolence, right? But I don't think go to a vinyasa yoga class 4 times a week is for everybody. I don't think it's going to heal everyone's trauma. I think there's ways that it can, and people have been traumatized within the yoga community. So I think we have to
totally true.
Temper our enthusiasm with a little bit of, humility or perspective or broad.
IFS doesn't do that.
Yeah. So is that why you decided to teach?
Well, there's a number of problems. I mean, that's one problem. So a lot of people, a lot of therapists I knew quit doing, say, EMDR, hypnosis, and only do IFS.
Okay, interesting.
And they completely don't use coping skills because IFS says managers' abilities are disrespected if you teach coping skills. And you don't need coping skills. You need to help people get into self. I mean, they have, which is a nice part of IFS, that they have kind of this concept that we have like this healthy place inside of all of us.
Yeah.
I thought it was sort of a positive cognition, but I've come to believe that that's true.
Yeah. But I've been challenged on that same belief at ISSTD conferences because I hold that same sort of belief from my own experience. I have this experience through yoga, through meditation, that I can go somewhere really beautiful inside, right? And it's really helpful for me to remember that that's not the case for everyone. And even if it is there, if that's my belief and I believe that it's there and I can help them find it. I mean, the language I'm trained in, I would say coping skills would help them find it, right? Like coping with the things that are overwhelming, that are painful, that have been internalized from other aggressors. Like those are the things that I would think would help grow a place of peacefulness or a place of self that we can connect with in a positive way, right?
They don't like coping skills.
I wasn't aware of that. That's interesting.
They also teach that phase-oriented treatment doesn't lead to healing. Phase-oriented, this is sort of a quote from the guy who used to run all their complex trauma trainings. He said, phase-oriented treatment, I don't like it. Do you know what phase-oriented treatment therapists do? If somebody comes in with a suicidal part, they say, you suicidal part, we don't like you, go away. And I'm like, seriously?
That's not, that's not my understanding of phase-oriented treatment at all.
It's not my understanding either. And
yeah. And I think that's what happens sometimes with like one training, or if like I was just thinking of this, I myself and I know other people who've created trainings all on their own, right? And it's always going to be through that lens. So if someone has a strong experience with a certain word like coping skills, or right, it can really shape how that training comes across. I want to back up a little and ask, like, there's a lot of people who come to this podcast who are, learning about dissociation. And everyone I've spoken to last season described it a little bit differently. So how would you even just describe dissociation to someone who's just learning about it?
Well, I tend to have like a fairly comprehensive or eclectic view on what dissociation is, depending on who I'm treating, because
Definitely.
I think it can feel very different for different people.
Yes.
But basically, I like the BASC acronym. So Bennett Braun's BASC acronym, behavior, affect, sensation, and knowledge. You can have 4 dimensions that trauma can get dissociated on. You may have all the knowledge and none of the rest of them, or all the affect and none of the behavior, affect, and behavior, sensation, and knowledge. So that's one way things can get dissociated. And I basically think that the classic example of the kid who's raped at night and then has to go to kindergarten the next day. How do you pay attention in kindergarten if you don't dissociate?
Yeah.
Or, kid gets abused by a parent at night and then everybody's cheery having breakfast the next morning. I mean, there's
fragmenting.
Either you become crazy or you disconnect. And I think the people who don't have an ability to disconnect probably don't get to heal. They don't get through their childhood with any kind of capacity to heal or really have good relationships.
Right. And you mentioned earlier hypnosis, and there's that hypnotic element too, where some people, it's actually easier to access the coping skill of dissociating, right? Like okay, I'm going to get through this, and this is what I'm going to use to get through it. And it's going to look different for, different brains and bodies and people and spirits, depending on their circumstances, depending on how they're wired and the environment they're in. But there's something about like what you were describing, having to compartmentalize, having this fragmentation, this conflict, this confusion, that the conflict and confusion then lead to something has to disconnect here. Like it's not safe or even like conducive of creating a single reality, right? To not have some sort of splitting taking place.
And then there's the issue of, what if your parent has a dissociative disorder?
Oh, yeah.
So what if your parent is one way, then another way, then another way? I mean, and parents, it's like kids of teachers learning to become teachers. Kids of therapists become therapists sometimes.
Oh, I don't know anyone like that. What are you talking about?
I didn't think so. So parents have kids who, dissociate. Yeah. Because they learned that's how you handle things. You cut off, you split, and I used to think when I was doing hypnosis training, I just can't do containers. I had to really psych myself up to teach clients how to use containers because they don't work for me. They never worked for me until I realized that my husband, as I was making split-second timing leaving for work, would say, oh, I just have a couple things I need to ask you. Drove me crazy. So we'd have these little arguments, and I'd go to work, leave David home, and focus on working.
Yeah.
And then I thought, that's a container.
Yes. Yes, it is.
Compartmentalizing.
Yes.
So I think some of it is, if you can help people see how they're using dissociation in their life, you can help them build on it.
Yes.
People come in sometimes for consultations and they say, good news, my client's dissociating less. And I'm like, that's not good news. You want them to dissociate better. You want to upgrade their ability to dissociate.
Well, and it's interesting because you're using that word dissociate, and I'm thinking about when we use the word in movement terms, we're trying to isolate one movement from the other, disconnect one movement from the other, activate this muscle, but not that muscle, right? And so that, like you're describing a skill, and I think it's a skill across the spectrum, right? Like we talked about the kid who is abused at night, has to wake up and be cheery at breakfast. Like it's a skill to adapt. But what you're describing is with clients, I'm assuming, in treatment, perhaps in adulthood, refining like, well, are you aware of when it's happening? Can you be skillful with how and when?
Or basically, you don't remember anything from fourth grade.
Yeah.
You haven't, what I say is you have an unconscious lid on that material.
Yeah.
You don't have any brain disorders. That material's there, but you have an unconscious lid on it. So let's work on making that lid conscious. We'll evolve it into a container that you have conscious choices and control over.
And that's where you're saying dissociate better, right? Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Refine it, develop the skill.
And then the awareness that, lots of people use dissociation in their jobs, firemen, policemen. I always say, you can't like treat a kid who's just been in a horrible car accident if you're connecting with them. You have to dissociate so the blood isn't bothering you, so you can function.
Right.
So, and then you need to be able to go in and out of it. You need to be able to dissociate, reconnect. So I think I try to normalize it. I mean, I don't think people who have dissociative disorders come from another planet. They just come from a place where they have to use this ability to deal with extreme situations.
And one of the things I'm hearing in the way you're describing it, right, is that continuum of there's dissociation we're aware of, there's dissociation we're not aware of, there's dissociation that's related to really significant threat and trauma, there's dissociation that's related to, we always use the classic highway hypnosis example, like, where am I? What happened? Which exit? Oh, I missed my exit, right?
But I haven't had a car accident. So one part of me was driving competently, another one was kind of tuning out. So I didn't notice the exits going by, but I'm not weaving over the road so that there can be more than one thing going on at a time.
Yeah. So what is IFS for those? I'm sure most people listening have probably heard of it. I know there's a lot of therapists and helpers and healers and yoga teachers and such that are interested in this type of work. But can you break it down? And like for someone who's just learning internal family systems, like what is it and what's the goal of it?
Well, the goal is that, okay, let me think. I mean, another reason why I wrote this book is there is, in their training, they're teaching some misinformation. Like, for instance, coping skills aren't necessary.
Yeah.
Phase-oriented treatment doesn't lead to healing.
Yeah.
Things like that I find disturbing.
They felt like really big flags for you going in.
Well, if IFS is perfect and they can treat everybody, I should not be getting calls from people who were treated by, say, lead trainers.
Sure.
If lead trainers are screwing up people and making them decompensate, there's a problem with the model.
And that's not unique to IFS. Like that happens with a lot of therapies that are focused on trauma processing that perhaps don't understand dissociation, aren't able to screen for it or refer out or work with a collaborative. I've heard this about so many different alphabet soup therapies, right? Either it falls flat or a client decompensates or, they're kind of stuck in a circle of going around and around with the same things. and not feeling a lot of progress. But things like yoga, things like EMDR, we know they can open up a can of worms, right? And it sounds like that's the same with IFS.
Totally. And EMDR, to its credit, I mean, it started out the same way, saying one size fits all, this will heal everybody. And they started popping out people with dissociative disorders. So now they teach, that everybody should be given the DES, the dissociative experience scale. I don't think they do enough. So when I've been involved in EMDR trainings and the trainer allows me, I'll do the half an hour on dissociative disorders.
Great.
And, but they acknowledge that you can't use standard EMDR with people with dissociative disorders, and you shouldn't be. If you don't know that territory, don't do it.
Right. Get
So
that training
they have that in their training program. But IFS has been pretty resistant to any of that.
Interesting.
So basically, I mean, and, they've trained over 10,000 people worldwide.
Yeah.
So many people know IFS. I just got another request for consultation from somebody who says, there's somebody in my caseload who has a dissociative disorder and I don't do IFS. And I'm like, well, IFS wouldn't teach you how to treat this person. But people think it's an ego state method.
Right.
And so they know how to treat people with dissociative disorders. Actually, they don't know how to notice when someone has a dissociative disorder because they also think diagnosing is pathologizing. I think therapists pathologize. You can use anything to pathologize, not just the DSM.
No.
But so IFS basically is an ego state therapy where one of the hallmarks is that we all have this self. And when you're in self, you can tell because you feel curious. There's a bunch of C's: curiosity, compassion for others, you're centered. I just think about curiosity and compassion because I get tired of remembering lists of things.
It sounds a lot like the window of tolerance, even to go back to like 1999 and Dan Siegel's work. And I think a lot of therapists these days are steeped in at least, those basic theories of our nervous system and activation and defenses. And so it just makes me think of that, what we might call a regulated or a flexible dynamic nervous system, one that can come to that, even from polyvagal theory, that can come to that relational ventral vagal place where, I'm calm, I'm connected, I can communicate, I'm centered, I'm just thinking all the C words.
So what IFS would say is if you're feeling anxious, that means you're blended with an anxious part. And they have a process where you get into self, and you can tell that you're in self if you look towards that anxious part and you feel compassion for it or interest in it.
Okay.
So they basically say, focus in on where you feel that anxiety in your body. And there are different possibilities, but it's like, ask that part of you to give you some space. What are you feeling towards that anxious part?
And it sounds like such a coping skill.
I mean, they say that too. This is all built
semantics in this way, right? Like, because I'm thinking, as I listen to you, I'm thinking of how this relates to so many other theories and trainings and things in that we are, not looking for this static point of regulation, but looking for this place where we can connect with ourselves.
No, they're looking for a static point of regulation.
Oh,
they want you to be in self all the time.
But
the goal is that you lead a self-led life.
Okay.
So that your parts can have input, but you're fundamentally in self. They acknowledge that nobody can do that completely, but
can you be angry or anxious and still be like, that's that process you were just describing, like you're in self, but you're blended with the anxiety or you're blended with the anger and you work.
Basically, you want to be able to be in self in relation to the part who's angry.
Okay.
And that part can say, this person is doing X, Y, and Z. And in self, you have the wherewithal to deal with it more.
Right.
What I teach is that, especially working with complex trauma population, is that you need to be able to slide out of it so you can pick up nonverbal communication. Because if you're in self, you're not going to pick up the nonverbal communication coming from a client. You need
Oh,
to be able to
interesting.
slide out of it and get yourself back into it.
Interesting.
But the treatment, the IFS treatment, basically is helping people get into self and then doing therapy through self with the part.
Okay.
And they
Okay.
have a process. So you get into self in relation to the anxiety, the anxious part, and then you say to the client, okay, so and so, ask that part. What does that part want you to know about it?
Mm.
So, and once the part is completely known by self, the next step is helping the part unburden from whatever traumatic material, like maybe that anxiety comes from childhood.
So what have you seen in IFS that you use, that you like, that works well, that you feel like is really helpful? Because I'm hearing a lot, like I'm hearing this through the lens of so many other angles and perspectives, and I'm hearing it in like a semantics way where it's like, well, what do we call, do we want to call that coping? Do we want to call that regulation? Do we want to call that self? And my opinion, my professional opinion is that and practice is to defer to the language that my client presents with and uses, right? Because there's so many things that can go with, especially depending on the dynamics around who I'm treating and age and gender and socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity and background. Like I don't want to be imposing something. And I think a lot of times when we learn and manualize therapy, we are imposing a structure and we're imposing something on that person. So
Well,
I
and
tend
I
to
think
hold all
I
that
think when
training and just
people
listen.
first learn a training, they're clumsy,
Sure.
and as you get to know it, you kind of make it yours and can talk about it with normal language. At least I think that's what most of us try to do.
Yeah.
And I think I impose my opinion on my clients depending on what's going on. I mean, someone came in and she said she wanted to do EMDR. She was really hot to do EMDR.
Yeah.
And I had a chat with her psychiatrist of 6 years and knew this woman, he was not picking up on the dissociative disorder.
Yeah.
And I said to her, I'm not going to do anything with you that's going to slow down your healing.
Right. And I think that professional opinion is really valuable. Like that's why people don't just walk over to someone on the corner at the coffee shop and say, "Hey, can I tell you about all my trauma?" Like that's why we go to a trauma therapist, and that person has training and opinions and perspective.
Yeah, and hopefully knows what they're doing. I mean, I do treat mostly people who've had bad treatment,
Yeah.
inadequate treatment,
Yeah.
and you probably do too.
Yeah. Have you seen so what have you seen that's helpful in IFS? Because I see it as like almost think of it as like an intro to ego state or dissociation. And I also think a lot of the parts they describe, the managers, firefighters, I see them more through the lens of neurobiology. So I'm just curious what you found. You said in the beginning, you find these trainings and then you're like, oh, I like this about it. What do you like about IFS? What
I
works well?
like, I've sort of come to like the concept of self,
Yeah.
but I like the languaging. I like I like the way that they locate parts, just like, oh, where do you feel that in your body? Ask that part who's holding those feelings to give you some space, or what are you feeling towards that part? Um, that's been really helpful.
Mm.
And they also have a dynamite process for sorting through countertransference, which they call the fire drill. That's
Okay.
part of what I'm going to teach at ISSTD.
Oh, good.
Um, and I think it's really super. I teach it to clients too. It's basically doing IFS. When somebody comes in and they're pushing all your buttons, it's basically identifying what parts of you are getting triggered,
Nice.
asking them to give you some space, and then working with each one to find out what they want you to know about the client and what they need from you to let you handle the session in your, um, I call it your adult therapist self.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I think one thing when I think in retrospect, there was a time when I burnt out, and I never thought that I got any kind of secondary PTSD. Not that I'd had any training in it. I didn't realize it was a when, not an if. And, I had this fantasy from grad school that if I did my job perfectly, no, it would never happen.
Right.
So I had cumulative PTSD. And what I figured out was I was doing therapy from a very skilled parentified child part. But it was a child part.
Wow.
So she was burning out. If I had done this fire drill thing, I would have discovered that sooner.
Nice.
I wasn't in an adult self. I was in a child part. And granted, she was very skilled.
Yeah.
However, it was still a burnout because she had an adult job and hadn't been healed.
Yeah.
So the fire drill is a great management technique, and it's great at helping identify stuff. But that's one of the things I like about IFS. I like the language. I like the concept of releasing burdens. I like that IFS has also taught so many people about ego state work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about the years that ISSTD has tried to promote ego state work, and how many therapists have told me, oh no, I don't work with dissociation.
Yeah.
I don't need to learn that. And trauma therapists, now they're all getting trained.
Yeah.
The problem is that they're being trained that they don't need coping skills. That, okay, if we do there's a quote in Dick's, one of his books, that says something like, if we do our job well, clients are going to get reactive during the week. They'll get angry, critical, become dependent. I'm like, and the other thing that they teach is that in self, people have everything they need. And what I would differentiate is that, from ISSTD, it's more like, we all have the capacity to heal, but you don't learn affect management from parents who are abusing you when they get upset, or drinking, or abandoning, or, that's just not magic. I think it really helps to get some training. And I agree with you that asking parts to give you some space is a coping skill, but it's more, I think of it more as a left brain one. You need to use your knowledge. You need to remember to do it, versus right brain ones like safe space imagery, containers, stuff that really uses, it sort of uses a dissociative ability, but I think those are really important for this population.
Yeah. So do you feel like IFS is contraindicated to certain, like, to dissociative disorders or to certain things? Where do you see that rub?
I think doing standard IFS with people with dissociative disorders is really a bad idea.
Okay.
I remember my first training with Rick Cluft, and he's like, do no harm and keep clients at their highest level of functioning, which was not what I learned in grad school. I learned to tell clients that they'd go down the tubes till, they started making progress. And it's like, no, we don't want that. Yeah. I want my clients to be keeping their day job, keeping their life, keeping friendships as much as they can, and building on that. Yeah. So I want them to have coping skills and be able to manage that.
And that makes me think of the phase-oriented treatment, and one of the principles that's in so many approaches, which is to bite off what you can chew, right? Like, don't bite off more than you can chew. That's the contrast I hear in what you just described. Like, are we going at a pace where you can digest these meals? And sometimes I think of it that way, like a physical meal. You don't want to take in or try to process so much that there's another reaction that you then have to get curious about and manage and aren't really sure what's going on. Right? Like, we want to just bite off, chew, that's done. Bite off, chew, that's done. And of course, that's a little more simplified and organized than it ends up being, but it's a good way to think about it.
I think it's great to be able to I mean, I like that analogy. I was just thinking I'd probably rip it off, because it makes so much sense. It's like you don't want to put in too big a mouthful
Yeah.
because you're just going to choke
Yeah,
or
exactly.
eat too much. It's
And
not
then
going to.
feel bad, right? And then you got to deal with the not feeling well on top of what you're already trying to process, whether that's grief or, anger or whole conglomeration of memory and emotion.
And I think another thing about IFS, I mean, like EMDR, it's a power therapy. Oh
Yeah.
my God, had these amazing sessions with people in a fairly short period of time, just using IFS, whipping through things. It's great.
Yeah.
But I don't think this population's it doesn't go there. And I think the potential is either people end up being in therapy for longer periods of time than they need to, having more difficulty during their therapy, or they fall apart. And then they come to me, but I'm not taking anybody. So
Yeah.
I'm working on training more people so that there's a population of IFS therapists who can work with dissociative disorders.
Yes.
One of my clients was for a long time was on the board of one of the internet listservs for people with dissociative disorders.
Mhm.
And he randomly said one day, I think I said something about IFS, and he said, when we get a new person on the listserv who says that they have an IFS therapist, we know they're in trouble.
Oh.
And I was like, oh my God,
Yeah.
because they just don't get it. Now, another thing that I really like about IFS is the concept of, so you have somebody who's sort of in self, which is complex for people with dissociative disorders, but just go back to standard IFS for a second. So someone's in self and you identify that there's a little kid part with a huge burden of anxiety or something. What you say is, so I say to the client, let that kid part, ask the kid part to not overwhelm you with those feelings. And one of the teachings in IFS is those kid parts can do that.
Yeah.
With people with dissociative disorders, there's the possibility that that kid part has no idea what burdens they're carrying.
Yeah.
Or they know it's anxiety, but they see the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And then, they may say, yes, sure, I'm not going to overwhelm you, and then not be able to do that.
Right.
So, I mean, that's one place where I see containers being useful. But once there's a container in place, being able to say to the kid part, hey, hold on to that traumatic material. Is that okay? And they can often do some of that, especially if you set up some help.
Yes.
So, I think IFS is great. And I think with some shifts, it can be a really solid treatment.
Yeah.
And it's impressive how many people are now using IFS to do ego state work and finding out how powerful it is.
Yes.
I mean, that they popularized that and popularized that we all have parts. I think it's dynamite.
Yeah. And now that is popular, what do you feel like it's important for people to understand about trauma and dissociation and IFS?
I think trauma light is fine. I think if people I think IFS therapists, this is what I wrote in my book, you need to know how to diagnose. You need to know what to look for when you're sitting with someone.
Yeah.
You need to be able to identify what symptoms they have that might lead to a dissociative disorder diagnosis or complex PTSD. You just have to listen to what they're saying and what they're not saying.
Yeah.
And, have those questions in mind.
Yeah.
You need to know how to help people have coping skills when they need them.
Yeah.
I long time ago heard there was research on safe space imagery that said if you do safe space imagery for 6 to 12 weeks, it resets your biological reactivity level. So I went contacted this former supervisor and said, where is that research? And he said, did I say that? So I have no idea, but it works in practice.
Mm.
And if somebody's reactivity level is up here because their body growing up, there was always depression, anxiety, terror, rage, their reactivity level is going to be up here when they're relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
Helping them learn safe space imagery so their reactivity level is, more normalized, makes the trauma work go better.
Yeah.
I mean, this just seems completely obvious to me.
Right. But you have a background and a breadth of training behind you going in. And I think that's the unique perspective that you bring to IFS that, I've seen a lot of folks that are coming out of grad school. And I remember this kind of stage for myself too, where I just was gobbling up trainings. Like, I want to do this one and I want to do that one. And oh my God, this works so well and that works so well. And there's this really great energy and enthusiasm. Yeah. Hunger and enthusiasm to share it. And I think what you're coming with is more broad and more integrative and also really specialized because, as you mentioned earlier, there's so many people who have medical degrees, psychological degrees, doctorates, masters, multiple degrees, who don't know how to sit with someone who has some form of dissociative disorder and work with it in a way that is healing, right? Like that's.
I mean, I think that's fine.
Right.
I really think, for whatever reasons, I don't like working with people with multiple chemical sensitivities. I've done it. I do a good job. It takes a huge amount of effort because for whatever reasons, it's not my thing.
Yeah.
I think it's fine if you don't want to work with complex trauma disorders, but I think you need to be able to identify people who have them.
Right.
And then send them to the right person.
Just that level of awareness, right? To be able to help people get to a place where they can.
Right. Or you don't want to hear about horrible trauma. Teach people coping skills. Do phase 1.
Yeah.
Accomplish that, And I think that, I do think our training programs should do a better job giving us some of these basics.
Yeah.
So when I teach, I try to provide that.
Right. And someone who is coming out of, a master's or a doctorate program and is doing IFS training, now they have your book, right? They can go and say, okay, if I have someone who shows up and I think, oh, this feels like complex trauma and dissociation, where do I go to learn about that?
Yeah. And my book, I tend to read detective books and novels.
Yeah.
I don't
mystery. Is it a mystery?
I don't read a lot of clinical books. I read when I'm writing.
Yeah.
But my book is the kind of book I like to read naturally.
Yeah.
So what I like with trainings and books is I like things handed to me on a platter so I don't have to digest it, figure out how to use it, and study it. I want it handed to me.
Yeah.
So I tried to write a book that was concrete.
Great.
It uses concrete language because people with trauma disorders need concrete language because they're more concrete than people are. Aside from that, if you're working with someone who has baby parts and child parts, they're not going to understand if I'm using huge vocabulary.
Yeah.
So it's written in a fairly concrete style with examples of how I explain things, which are pretty concrete.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of resources. You want more training, you can go over here. It's basically, I think Bethany Brand said she thought it was, she'd call it a handbook, a guidebook.
Yeah, that's great.
And I thought that's perfect. That's exactly it. It's not the be all end all, but it's a good once over if you don't know about dissociation. And it is mostly for IFS people, although there's, a chapter on basics on IFS if you don't know IFS. And I know lots of people who don't know IFS have read it because I've gotten emails.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think there are plenty of folks who've been in the field a long time who aren't in the place of I want to take every training that's popular right now, who hear the example or the outline of a training and go, yeah, 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 kind of like you said earlier, like, okay, this just sounds like a repackaging of something that I've already
Right.
learned, or it feels like, some people have long-term clients and they're not really looking for a new tool. They've kind of found a rhythm that's working for them. So
Yeah, well, then there are the therapists who have had a rhythm for a long time and could use some training.
100%.
I'm just saying.
I always think it's like I see it in cycles, right? There's going out, getting information, digesting that information. And then for me, I see it then as sharing it, like teaching it. You're like, oh, okay, I've really worked with this. It's in my brain and my body and my life. I can share it with other people now. And then there's a pause and it's like, okay, let's go get some more. Yeah,
Or
hungry again.
you get a client and there's, something's not working right. And it's like, what's not
Mhm.
working right? And
Mhm.
maybe there's something else. I
Yeah,
mean, I think it's an exciting time to be a therapist because there is all this really interesting stuff coming, or
plenty of
that's
material, plenty of material.
plenty of material and sometimes material overload. And I do think you're right about the repackaging. Sometimes I just am rolling my eyes when I hear, oh, here's another. In EMDR, they have the concept of a float back. A
Hmm.
float back is really an affect bridge,
Yeah.
but
And that's where it feels like semantics. It's like call it what you
I
will. Is
mean,
it effective? Is it serving the client? Is that the thing they need in the moment? And if the answer is yes, great. Right?
that reminds me, one thing I wanted to say is I've also talked to trauma consultants who say, what is it with this IFS stuff? Somebody came in and I didn't even get why they were having problems, because it's important to know IFS doesn't teach coping skills. They don't believe in them. They say they're bad. They
Mm,
say they are bad for managers. Like you're taking a manager who has been handling things for years and you're saying you're not doing good enough. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, uh, this is what I say. I say, you see this smartphone? I had a dial phone when I was a kid. I had a flip phone at some point. I don't use that anymore. You know,
yeah.
kids grow up, they have all or nothing defenses. They do the best they can. We can make this a little higher tech and it'll
We'll
be,
upgrade. We'll
yeah, it's an
upgrade.
upgrade.
Yeah.
I like to upgrade
Yeah.
people's abilities to manage.
Yeah.
And, I have not had a lot of managers complain. But
Yeah.
I think the deal with the language IFS speak is that IFS therapists, they go to IFS consultants, and then if things get bad enough, they might break out and come see somebody like me or
Mhm.
another consultant. If you don't know anything about IFS, it can be confusing.
Right.
So I think that's partly why I wanted to do some trainings at ISSTD. It's like, it's good because there's so many people being trained in IFS and they're not being trained in working with dissociative disorders. And because it's an ego state model, it pulls for people
Yes.
to think that they know how to do it.
Yeah.
And they have a good foundation, but they need a little more.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're offering through your book really concrete ways. Like, here, I put it out on a platter for you. Here are the things, the places where there was a little rub for you where you go, no, if you're working with dissociation, that's not going to cut it. Or where your experience, your vast experience in going into the IFS training came into conflict with what they were teaching, right? So that you can say,
Yeah.
think about it. What about this circumstance where someone might really need phase-oriented treatment? What about this circumstance where someone might really need coping skills before even talking about parts, perhaps? And I think one thing that I feel like I've been just so humbled by doing this work over years because every time I get excited about something specific, I learn from a client, like, this is like, they'll teach you, my clients teach me what they need, right? If I'm really listening. And so I can hold, okay, this training or that training or this perspective or this language, and then like bring it in a way where, sometimes someone will take it and run with it and you go, this is like, we found a key and it's unlocking something and this is amazing. And sometimes you get pushback that it's not the right time. And sometimes you get a message that it's like, this actually is doing the opposite of what we want it to do. So let's try something different. Let's try a different time or a different approach. So I feel like that is hard because when you're a younger therapist, you want to just have that mastery. I mean, I think we all want to have that mastery. I want to feel like I have the one thing and I can help anyone that shows up at my door. Um, but
Clough said that in that.
yeah.
He
But
said,
like I don't
I
feel
was
that way.
like,
I feel
this
like
is
I can help you
perfect.
get where you need to go. I feel like I can help you get where you need to go, but I don't feel like I'm the one that can help any and everyone. And why would I be? We're all so different. We're such a diverse group of humans. Like we need different people. We need community. No one just needs one person. Or, I feel like one approach. So I think it's great that you wrote this book and that you're, letting people know, hey, heads up, before you stumble upon this on your own or before you're unintentionally harming someone, because we always come back to that do no harm, and it's much easier said than done because most of the harm that we do is not intentional, right? It's through things like these where we get.
Yeah, absolutely. Or therapists think they're doing a great job, or, the client who they don't know is dissociative is, struggling, and their consultant says, you're doing a great job, keep going.
Yeah.
But if their consultant doesn't know where to go, they're kind of stuck. And then, I feel bad when they come to me and I'm like, not another one, but it's okay. I mean, I'm always happy when people come in. And yeah, it is at the moment the only, I mean, I wrote a chapter a few years ago on dissociation in IFS. I mean, I did it when I was doing more EMDR. I wrote a chapter on EMDR and dissociation.
Yeah.
There's now much more stuff on that, but I just think it's so important.
If you're listening to this podcast thinking, I want to learn more body-based tools to help support trauma recovery, then you might be the perfect candidate for the Yoga for Trauma online training program. This 8-week certification is for wellness providers and enthusiasts who want to learn the theory and best practices for providing yoga and somatic tools to those navigating the impacts of trauma. Students often come into the Yoga for Trauma online training program, or Y4T as it's come to be known, knowing at a deep level that mindful movement can help with trauma recovery, but not knowing precisely how to articulate it or share these tools with others. Y4T breaks it all down and leaves you feeling clear about your choices as you support folks navigating post-traumatic stress. Of course, the experience is good for you too. With 8 modules and 8 yoga classes, you'll get a taste of how it feels to practice yoga in a trauma-responsive manner. Head on over to howwecanheal.com/Y4T to apply and join the program today. Mention the podcast in your application for a special bonus. One more time, nice and slow. The website is howwecanheal.com/the letter Y, the number 4, and the letter T. Looking forward to seeing you there. I'm curious because we're talking a little bit about, being open to changing your beliefs. Like you get trained in one thing and then you run up against a roadblock, or you get feedback from a client, you have to sort of get more training or learn to use different language or a different approach. So I'm curious if there's anything for you recently that has changed in the way you think about trauma and recovery, or in your experience of working with dissociation. It might be IFS related. It might not.
That's an interesting question. I mean, one thing, I don't know. There's a couple, I just did some training in ketamine assisted therapy.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which was fascinating.
Yeah.
And I want to get more. I think that I'm kind of a funny person. I mean, I've sort of backed through a lot of things. I'm often like, oh no, that's not going to work. And then I take a training and I'm like, okay, I figure I can't complain about something if I haven't done the training.
Yeah.
So
fair.
That's one of my principles. But, in doing different trainings and shifting how I work, that some of my longer term clients occasionally have said, Joanne, you haven't done anything new in a while. When are you getting a different training? And my communication to them is, I want them to learn.
Yeah.
So like you're talking about, when have I had a belief that's gotten shaken?
Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to shake up a lot of beliefs that my clients have.
Yeah.
I want them to start believing different things and experiment with different things. Like I want them to go from thinking I'm the reason why I was abused my whole childhood to actually my parents had a lot of problems. It wasn't me.
Yeah.
If I had been plucked out of there and dropped in a different family, I would be a different person.
Wow. Yeah.
So I figure if I'm going to ask them to do that, the least I can do is be watching my beliefs.
Mm.
Although I do have some strong ones, like I think people need to notice when their clients are dissociating, and they need to look at the research and look at like what Bethany Brand is doing,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
in kind of doing research on the ways that we found that work and saying, okay, now research backs it up too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you know, they need to use the technology that we have
Yeah.
that's been proven. And okay, I'm open to something new, but I also want it to be grounded.
It's so interesting because I think of it like co-consciousness, right? We want people to be aware that dissociation exists. We want therapists who aren't in this line of work to just know it enough to see it and send it somewhere, right? Just like if you were an MD, I don't know, if you specialize in ear, nose, and throat, and you see something on someone's knee and you refer them to an orthopedic surgeon or whoever the appropriate person is, like, oh, I don't specialize in that, but I see that it's a bump and you're going to want to get that checked. Like, here, go to this department. I think that's where we're looking for, just that level of awareness and sort of co-consciousness within a field of mental health providers or larger health providers, to just be able to say, I've heard of that thing. I know where to send you, right? Rather than, sure, I specialize in ear, nose, and throat, but let me take a look at your knee.
Or there's something going on that I think is potentially a problem,
Yeah.
and you should get it. I'm not sure what it is, but you need to get it checked out.
Yeah. Just
Right.
referring to get more support, to get more, experienced eyes on, so that people can navigate, in a way that hopefully is helpful for them.
So I think it's important for people who aren't therapists, who are dissociation trained, but not IFS trained, to know enough about IFS. So if they run into an IFS therapist, they have something to say that,
Mm-hmm.
you could at least say, okay, there's this one book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And hopefully at some point there'll be more than one book. But right now, there's me, which I think is kind of funny.
But I
But
think it's great. And I'm so glad you
whatever.
wrote this book. I know it's a lot of time and energy and effort to put your thoughts together in a book and to
It's
organize
also
them.
one of the things has both validated the energy and time I put into writing it, but is also kind of depressing, is the emails I get. I've gotten emails from people all over the world
Yeah.
saying, I've been in IFS for 5 years. I've gone down the tubes
Mm,
and I've been so depressed. And I
yeah.
read your book and now I realize it's not me. And I'm like,
It's why you wrote it, but it's
that's
also
why I wrote
bad.
it. But, it's really too bad. And can you help me find a therapist? Can you help me find an IFS therapist? And I'm like, yeah, hard.
Yeah.
Take my book, find a decent IFS therapist who's willing to read it with you.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
Um, a good therapist should be able to pick up some of this stuff. I mean, I learned on the job. I think a lot of people learn
Most
how to
people
work
do.
with dissociation on the job.
Most
If you
people do.
don't have some access to automatic training.
Yeah. If you're not raised by someone who specializes in
Exactly.
dissociation. I'd be like, Mom, my consultation in school, they don't know how to work with dissociation, but I wanted to ask you this question.
Or they say it doesn't exist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I even
I
had
mean, I
that.
still get people
Um,
saying it doesn't exist, or the IFS people who say, which baffles me, that yeah, you don't need to worry about parts are parts are parts.
Hmm.
And we never get rid of any parts. I'm like, yeah, I worked with someone with 50 baby parts. Nobody needs 50 baby parts.
Oh,
Those 50 baby parts integrated into one stronger baby part, and
yeah.
they were happy.
Yeah. Yeah. More
Um,
manageable.
yeah. I mean, we don't know what happens inside people's heads, but I think metaphors have to make sense.
Right.
Um,
So where would you send someone who wants to learn more?
who wants to learn more about this? I tell them to read my book.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
do you have a website as well or any trainings
oh,
coming?
yeah.
What's next for you?
Well, I'm there's a group called the Untherapy, I think, and I'm doing a little workshop for them.
Awesome.
But I'm giving a 2-day workshop for people in Barcelona on Zoom in, I think, May. And then in September, I'm giving 4 days of workshops in Australia. Um,
Awesome.
and at some point, I'm going to set up something more here.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
also planning on doing a consultation, kind of a hybrid didactic / consultation group.
Awesome. Oh,
So
that's
I'm
great.
working on setting that up for
Great.
IFS therapists, because I think there's a real need for IFS therapists who can work with complex trauma and dissociation.
100%. And I just have one more question before we wrap today. I'm curious. I love asking people this. You do a lot of trauma work. There's a lot of, trauma that comes across your plate, things that you see that are horrific or challenging or traumatizing. What brings you hope as you do this work?
I think it's the healing.
Yeah.
You know, I sometimes say to people, you got through your childhood by yourself. We'll get you through your healing. We're two adults sitting here together.
Yeah. That's great.
Um,
I love that.
and I mean, I don't watch a lot of violent movies or movies where there's lots of child abuse because I hear enough about it. And I also have no control. But if I'm sitting with someone who's in my office, I know they have a good chance of healing. I'm
Mm-hmm.
stacking the deck in favor of them having more of the life they would have had with a healthier childhood.
Yeah.
And I see that. I see
Yeah.
people making changes. So, and I mean, one of the gifts I think of working with these people with big trauma histories is that, you know, when something bad happens to someone, I'm like, yeah, you can heal from that.
Yeah.
If somebody can go through these kind of childhoods and heal, yeah, you can heal from this too. So it gives me a lot of grounding in the possibility of healing. Not that
100%.
I'm not like a total Pollyanna. I know there are people who don't have the capacity to heal, um, or for one reason or another. But does that answer your question?
You've seen it happen enough times. Yeah, it does. And it reminds me of I met this woman once. We were in like a meditation group, and at the time I was running a ton, right? Just like I had coached for this half marathon training. I'd done a ton of marathons, ultra marathons, and she was so impressed. She was like, "Wow." And I was like, "Oh, you could totally do this. Like you sign up for this half marathon training. I bet you by, about 4 months, you could do a half marathon. You don't have to run the whole thing. You can walk it, you could walk it, whatever, but you could totally do it." And just that awareness of like, yeah, this is possible. And, she actually signed up for the training and was like, "Thank you so much." Just that knowledge of it's possible.
How do you learn? I mean, and that's what we tell clients too, is it's like there's a clear path to healing.
Yeah.
but you have to know the path.
Yeah.
I know the path.
Yeah.
There's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
And you've got to just sign up, it's not as clear cut and structured as, at a mile every Saturday, but there are pathways, right? And I think that confidence you describe is really beautiful, because when people are in the thick of something really traumatic, when they're feeling really overwhelmed or consumed by it, it can be hard to see that path. It can be hard to even know it exists. So someone saying that path exists, I think, can be such a relief. And then just knowing, okay, I've just got to keep showing up on this path, and there's somewhere I can go that's going to feel good for me, right? It's going to feel better. I think that confidence is key and so refreshing, right, for someone to
Well,
hear.
and there's these little things, like I sit in therapy with somebody and I'm like, I don't know what the hell I'm going to get this person through this. I have no idea what we're going to do. And now what I do is I say, I don't know how we're going to get you through this, but we've gotten we've been here before.
Yes.
And yeah, I have no clue how we're going to do this, but we'll keep working together. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
There's a freedom in being able to say, yeah, at this moment in time, I'm totally clueless.
Yeah.
And nothing's going to work. And we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this was what it was like when you were a kid.
Right.
That it felt
I wonder if I'm feeling
was going to work.
Yeah. I wonder if we're feeling this together, right? That's so true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom, and for writing your book, for putting it together, for getting it out there. I'm really excited about those consultation/training groups that you're putting together. And, we're recording in January. This is going to come out in 2024, but I'm not sure exactly when. So when folks hear this, go on Joanne's website, see what's coming up next, whether you're in Australia or Barcelona, you said.
I'm going to do that one on Zoom. There aren't enough Spanish speakers to pull together an in-country one. So I'll work on getting my book translated into Spanish.
Awesome. I love that. Beautiful. Great. Well, thank you so much for all you do and for coming on the show. And joannetwombly.net if you want to learn more and get the book. It's available all over the place. Super easy online, and you can just get some of that information on a platter and share the love, share the wealth of information. So, people don't have to spend 5 years just coming back around to something really that Joanne's put together. So thank you, Joanne. Maybe we'll have you back one of these days.
All right. Well, thank you. This was fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the show notes for each show. Thanks for your messages, feedback, and ideas about the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I so appreciate your support. There are lots of ways you can support the show, and I'm grateful for every little bit of love you share. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can always visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas as well. Before we wrap, I want to be clear that this podcast isn't offering any prescriptions. It's not advice or any kind of diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and we encourage you to consult with any healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. In addition, everyone's opinion on this show is their own, and opinions can change, right? Guests share their thoughts, not that of the host or sponsors. I'd also like to send just huge thanks to our guest today, to Kyle Arizbal of Prolific Sound Solutions, and to everyone who helps support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking care of the babe and the fur babies while I record. Lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so happy to share it with you here.